Hello, and welcome to AntKast by Ant Group. It's a podcast that brings you deep into conversations with global thinkers, innovators, and entrepreneurs on groundbreaking technology and how they're shaping our lives for better or for worse. I'm your host, Eric Hong, coming to you from Shanghai. In this episode of AntKast, we welcome a distinguished guest, tech strategy expert Jeffrey Towson, to talk about what is the platform business model and strategy. Jeff is a consultant, investor, and speaker in digital strategy and digital companies with over 20 years of experience across US, China, Asia, and the Middle East. He is also a professor at the China-Europe Business School in Shanghai and at the Sasin School of Management in Bangkok. Jeff is also a best-selling author, having written 6 books, including his latest one, Moats and Marathons, How to Build and Measure Competitive Advantage in Digital Businesses. Welcome to our show, Jeff.
Great, thank you. I appreciate being here. Great.
Jeff, besides what I mentioned in the brief intro, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I think you got most of it. It's I basically do strategy and business analysis. I look at companies all day long. That's what I look at. And within that, I look at the intersection of competition and digital. So that involves, everything from AI to platform business models, but I'm generally trying to figure out who's going to win. Who's going to build a dominant business that is very hard to take down, who used to have a dominant business, but software is changing the rules of the game, and it's not what it was. That's usually where I'm focused. And then based on that, I advise a lot of companies. I create a lot of sort of writing, speaking, podcasting, all of that, sort of teaching, talking about it. It's all sort of the expression of the same general theoretical focus.
Yeah, so knowing that you have over 20 years of experience in this in different geographic locations and with a specific focus on US, China, and Asia, so in your eyes, what's the winning and losing strategy for a company in the digital age? Could you share maybe some examples? Also, do you see any differences between the East and the West in terms of this?
Yeah, we can put these into 2 buckets. We can talk about sort of digital natives, businesses that were built on software. I say digital software, data technology. It's all the same thing. It's stuff made of bits and bytes on a screen, ones and zeros, as opposed to factories, people, right? We can talk about digital natives, so that gets us into the land of Alibaba and Amazon and Google and these big famous companies, which are fun to talk about. The bigger group is more traditional businesses that are now becoming infused with software. Factories, banks, insurance companies, retailers, definitely. And in some cases, that can be a total game changer, which is usually the case in media and financial services and retail. In other cases, it's not that big of a deal. Starbucks doesn't really have a digital strategy. They're still selling cups of coffee. Right, so that's a bit of a spectrum. And I'm usually looking at mostly at the digital natives because there's a lot of good lessons and they tend to be on the frontier. But we're seeing, traditional companies that are very good at digital and have become, like in China, Ping An, which was an insurance company and then a bank and then a wealth trust company. You could argue they're really a digital company now. So sometimes it's like that. To answer your second part, I focus a lot on Asia and the US. China, obviously, within Asia is the big story, because that just tends to be where most of the innovation is happening. In the US, we can look at GE, we can look at Google, we can look at Amazon. In Asia, we can look at Alibaba, and it's just where the leaders are. Within those 2, the biggest differences, probably, if it's China in particular, has a tremendous consumer side. Everybody's on a smartphone. There's a lot of people. And it also tends to be the part of the world where manufacturing is done. So anytime you're looking at a digital story, if it's mostly about consumer adoption and or manufacturing, China is usually the leader. So that might be something like bike sharing. Lots of consumers on bicycles. Where are all the world's bicycles made? They're made in China. DJI drones, hardware, pretty much anything that's got a massive hardware component. Drones, industrial robots, things like that, smartphones, they all tend to be China, Asia. U.S. is much more of a B2B story. Often enterprise, healthcare, the U.S. tends to be better. And that's a pretty simple way to look at it, but it's pretty true.
Yeah, to your point, you said there are some companies that, although traditional, not necessarily digital native, they have adopted very well in the digital age. Are there any such examples in the US?
Yeah, there's a lot of them in the U.S. One of the benefits the U.S. and the West had in digital is you have a long history of companies putting in ERP systems. I mean, banks in the US have been putting in software since the 80s. You know, this is what Microsoft and Oracle and SAP have been selling forever. So when you had these more traditional businesses putting in software and back office systems for 20, 30 years, it was a lot easier for them to start to go digital with that because you kind of already had it there. A lot of Chinese companies, we don't have that. We see digital natives moving very, very quickly. Tencent, TikTok, but most Chinese companies they were quite small in the 90s, and you also had fairly low labor costs, so there was not as much of an imperative to we've got to build software across the back end. So they tend to be high. And if you go to a typical factory in China today, it's going to be much less digitized than one, say, in Germany, just by history and labor costs. So they're catching up a bit there. So definitely we see that in the U.S. side. We can look at pretty much all of Microsoft's clients in the West over the past 30 years, and we're going to see traditional companies that have been digitizing slowly. And now they're moving on to the cloud and they're applying AI and analytics because they're already kind of halfway there. China's a bit more, it's a young country. A lot of these businesses, even the most advanced ones, are 30 years old. That's pretty short. So there's differences there, but those distinctions are kind of going away.
Right. And speaking of these sort of newer large companies, the ones that you talked about, that leads me to talk about, and also the topic of this episode, platforms and platform economy, also something you discuss a lot on your podcasts and articles and in your book. So what makes you so interested in platform economy?
Yeah, I mean, when you start looking at, I keep using the term digital, but that's a lot of stuff, right? I mean, it keeps changing, and how that impacts businesses and changes them. There's usually 4 buckets you can kind of look at within that, and if you look at those 4 buckets, you'll get a pretty good read. But they're really different things, and number 1 on that would be platforms. I mean, platform is just a type of business model, and it turns out, when you're using software, it's very easy to build platforms. That would be kind of one phenomenon under this idea of digital. The other 3 I generally point to is you can look at just digital economics, that anytime something becomes more digital, it becomes free. That's a big deal. You can look at AI and you could look at blockchain. Those are probably 4 buckets that are all a whole lot of thinking, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of thinking in all 4 of those things. But within platforms, it just turns out this was really a powerful phenomenon. The distinction, which, there's some very good platform thinkers out there. There's platform institutes. MIT has a platform economy center. The phrase that came out of a book called Platform Revolutions, which is quite good, is business models can be pipelines or they can be platforms. Most businesses are pipelines. It's a linear process. You buy the supplies, you manufacture the product, you distribute it, you sell it, you do cuts. It's a linear process of adding value as a business. as opposed to a platform business model, which is a network-based business, where you're not doing sort of a sequence of events, activities. So all of these, there's a lot of, I generally point to 5 different types of platform business models, but they're all basically in the interactions business in some form. And it just turns out that's a fairly powerful business model. It scales beautifully. It tends to be a winner-take-all business, or one or two companies tend to dominate. So you might have thousands of restaurants in Beijing, but you're going to have 1 or 2 platform business models for watching videos. So that business model tends to lead to a couple dominant companies quite naturally. And, people love that. So venture capitalists love that. Entrepreneurs love that. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to think about it. But there's a lot of people who do a lot of thinking about platform business models.
Right. I know you have described platforms almost as if in an ecosystem where you have merchants or suppliers and you have the users. So talking about a successful platform business model or winning strategy, what makes the platform meaningful and attractive to these platform participants?
Right. I mean, people have slightly different definitions for this stuff, so I'm giving you mine. Mm-hmm. But if you're selling it in your traditional business, you're making food at a restaurant, you have one user group, which is the customer. You make a product, you make it better, pipeline business model. If you're in a platform, you have at least 2 user groups. In this case, merchants trying to sell stuff, consumers trying to buy stuff. For this to function, you have to make both groups happy so they participate. If all the consumers show up and the merchants don't show up, it doesn't work, and vice versa. And that's actually kind of tricky, because if you give customers everything they want, the merchants are probably not happy. And if you give merchants everything they want, the customer. So you kind of got to balance it out, and it can actually be kind of tricky to get it to work. But people kind of generally know. So if you're in the platform business model, you are in the interactions business. We facilitate successful interactions. And generally that means doing a couple things. It means giving merchants and consumers various tools so that they can participate. You give them an app. You give them access to logistics to ship products back and forth. You have a way to make payment. You've got to do certain things to make this work. But then you also have to sort of manage the incentives and the governance of the 2 user groups such that they participate. What is it going to make the merchants show up? What is going to make the consumers show up? What happens when there's a problem, when there's a dispute? So you're kind of like a little private, not government, but you're doing governance-like activities. And it's actually pretty tricky. But it gets a lot more complicated when you go into something like dating sites. And you've got to get women and men to both participate. And then if, there's bad behavior, the women leave immediately, and then the men leave. I mean, that's a trickier ecosystem to make work. And then when you get into content, it's even a bigger problem, because if people are posting horrible content, violence, one, the viewers are going to have a problem, and 2, the government's going to have a problem very quickly. You need to control this content, and then the video site, let's say TikTok or YouTube or whatever, they don't quite know how to do that. It's like people are uploading millions of videos every day. We can't watch them all. There's no way to physically watch them. And the AI doesn't understand what's in the content. So there's not a great way to do content curation at scale. So when you do these different types of platforms, you realize there's a lot of, it can be very difficult. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's working well, like marketplaces, and other times it's kind of half broken.
Right. So it seems at first maybe scalability was a very strong advantage that made these platforms grow so fast. by attracting users and content and goods and services. But at some point, its scalability can also pose a challenge for them. And I want to ask if there are any ways or tools that companies, platforms are able to tackle and face this challenge. Maybe some examples in the West that you have seen.
I mean, everyone loves platforms for multiple reasons. They tend to be winner take all, winner take most. Couple companies win. They have network effects. People love network effects. They're highly scalable. A company like YouTube or TikTok, they can go to billions of users in a couple years around the world. That's crazy, right? So there's a lot to like in that. One of the problems is when your business scales in one way, like users and content creators, but it doesn't scale in another way. Like nobody knows how to accurately moderate content, which you have to do. Like you have to, because people will post the most horrible stuff you've ever seen. Once you move into video and content and social media, it becomes a much bigger issue than just, doing stuff. And we could say the same about dating sites. We could say the same about payment mechanisms. We could say the same thing about innovation platforms like GitHub, Microsoft Windows, Android, where those are also platform business models that are a different type. There are a lot of people that are frustrated with, let's say, Apple developers because they want the smartphone operating system, iOS, and the App Store. That's a platform. The two user groups are people who use the phone and people who develop software that run on the phone, apps. Well, those people are very frustrated because Apple's charging them 30%. And Apple is limiting, and a lot of developers don't want to spend a lot of time and effort building on Apple because they don't feel it's a good environment for them to invest years of their life. And they say, look, there's only two of these systems. There's Android and there's iOS. And a lot of Chinese companies, they're saying we should have 3 or 4 of these systems that run on smartphones. And it's not really even 2, it's mostly Android. We don't want the whole innovation platform for the whole world to be 2 companies. We need more, which I agree with. I think that would actually be a healthy thing if we had 4, 5, or 6 of these companies that app developers were building on. So this plays out everywhere, right? It's fun to take it apart.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I know you have covered Ant Group extensively in your articles in your past. How would you analyze Ant Group's platform business model, and what are the things that you think maybe we're doing right?
China is very unique in many ways when it comes to digital. So you kind of have to look at a company like Ant in China, and then you have to look at Ant International, which are related, but they often are different because China is very unique in a lot of what goes on in digital. What Ant, and we could say WeChat Pay as well. I mean, they really get credit for they pioneered mobile payment. They were years ahead of everybody. I mean, the whole QR code thing, they found that strange QR technology which some Japanese engineer invented to track supply chain, and they turned it into a payment mechanism. That's where it came from. So when you look at sort of financial innovation and platforms, I mean, really you have to look at China as the leader in many ways. And a lot of companies, especially in Brazil, like Nubank, I mean, they are clearly copying Ant from 2018 because it turns out it's a really good model. There was a lot that was really positive there, and I liked. Outside of China, when you're talking about Ant, okay, then it's a different story. Then we're looking at Alipay, which is, really compelling. Alipay Plus in Southeast Asia, in other parts of Asia, probably going into places like Europe. And then you're mostly, at this point in time, you're talking about payment and you're talking about marketing services. You have a bunch of Chinese tourists showing up in Paris who all use their mobile phones. Wouldn't it be nice if they could pay in Paris using their phones and have it automatically converted and all the Forex and settlement and clearance happen seamlessly? That's good for the merchants of Paris. It's good for the Chinese tourists. That's win-win, right? Totally fine. And you could say the same thing if you're looking at Alipay Plus with, people from Malaysia flying into the Philippines, same thing, seamless payment. And then you naturally go into marketing services. Well, if they're, buying from your store on their trip to the Philippines from Singapore, we should have those merchants should be able to market to them when they arrive and maybe when they come back. And that all is win-win too, right? And if we look at Latin America, I was just there a couple months ago meeting with a lot of companies that are doing this. They're all copying Ant. I mean, that's what they're doing. I mean, they're starting with payment. They're not using mobile pay, they're using credit cards, but it's really just a payment mechanism. And then they're moving into other, it's the Ant playbook, which I think is dramatically more appropriate for most of the world than, say, looking at what's coming out of the US, which is Stripe, PayPal, Square. Facebook was doing Calibra, which was nutty. Most countries in the world are far better off looking at what's happening in Asia for payment than they are looking at the US. And then there's blockchain and crypto and.
And speaking of payment and fintech companies in Europe or in the US, and as you mentioned, probably a little bit behind compared to Asia, why would you say the reason is behind this difference in development of fintech and how mainstream it is?
It's probably a combination of a couple things. One of which I mentioned earlier, which is that you have a lot of consumers who are on their phones all the time, and they are particularly eager adopters. Things get adopted faster in China, generally. If it's on a smartphone, it's going to get adapted faster. That's just cultural. Also, there were bigger problems to be solved. Like, if most Americans have credit cards, and if you go from a credit card to mobile payment, it's better, but it's not dramatically better. But, 10 years ago, most Chinese didn't have credit cards. They had debit cards. So for them to go from a debit card and mostly cash to a mobile, it was a big step up. So you get a much bigger bang for your digital app and we see the same thing in Indonesia. We see the same thing in Southeast Asia. A lot of these mobile apps that are coming are dramatically better than what exists. Amazon is good, but it's not dramatically better than Walmart in the US. So you're getting a much bigger delta of improvement in a lot of countries. And I think China definitely got that. And then I think it's just probably the companies. I think in the US, you have these Square, Stripe, PayPal, but in China, we've had this scenario for a long time where we had a handful of very large companies with lots of services. And so they're able to innovate faster. They can roll stuff out, Tencent, Alibaba, several companies. They can roll stuff out to hundreds of millions of consumers in a year, right? So things do tend to move a bit faster when they come out of those companies. It's like multiple things.
Yeah. And actually talking about, different standards or different markets, and even in terms of payment, when we look at Southeast Asia, each country has their own wallet. When you first read about Alipay Plus's business model, were you surprised that, it's something different from Alipay? And what do you think is the potential of it?
I mean, it was a significant change from what Ant was doing internationally, 2014 to 2018. Right? They were doing various deals with lots of countries, all over the place. Philippines, Pakistan, all over the place. They were doing some investment in banks. They were building sort of a global payment system, or at least expanding out internationally. Well, since then, a bunch of things have happened since then. And one is that the payment world has just changed dramatically. Now everyone's talking about crypto payments and, Bitcoin without an intermediary, decentralized payment systems, which was what Bitcoin was supposed to be. It turns out it's not very good for making payments. It's great for speculating and storing money. But so the payment world is just being technologically turned on its head in the last couple of years. And someone asked Warren Buffett, because he's an investor in MasterCard, American Express, and he even said, I can't predict what payment is going to look like in 5 years. I mean, it is just, we've got digital wallets, we've got apps, we've got crypto, we've got decentralized. I mean, it is, so there's just tremendous technological change. And then at the same time, all of that is very dependent on regulations country by country. So there's just a lot of moving pieces right now. But I think one of the things we can conclude is the system we saw in China, which was WeChat Pay, Alipay, and then some smaller ones. I mean, there's Meituan Pay and JD Pay, but those are the big ones. We're not seeing that same pattern in most of the world. We're seeing, like, if I walk across, I'm in Bangkok, if I walk across the street and go to the little coffee shop, on the payment, there will be 10 different ways I can pay. There'll be QR codes on the little counter. It covers half the counter. I can pay with the local bank app. I can pay with True Money, the local digital wallet. I can pay. I mean, we're not seeing two payment mechanisms. We're seeing like 5 to 10 in every country. Every bank has its own payment mechanism now and digital wallet. But then we also have companies like Qcash, and we have these digital players, and then we have social media companies. They're adding wallets. Facebook is doing it. So the idea is, it looks like we're going to see at the city level, in the country level, every country is just going to have lots and lots of ways to pay. It ain't going to be winner take all, And I think we see that in Indonesia, we see it in Singapore, we see it in Thailand, we see it in Brazil. It's like, payment is almost like a commodity at the domestic level. But cross-border, okay, that's a trickier question. Do I think every little one of these payment mechanisms on the cafe across the street is going to be able to take payments from Brazilians and Chinese who show up with their phones? No, never going to happen. There needs to be another company, and that's Alipay Plus. That's the back office connection. That's a great problem looking for a solution. It makes sense for a company out of China that already has that to be, but then also not to compete with the local domestic digital wallets, which they would not like. Win-win, right? Win-win. So yeah, that struck me as and I kind of come to expect this from Ant. So yeah, I thought that was quite cool.
So knowing that you live in Bangkok currently and teaching at the Sasin School of Management in Bangkok, as well as a professor in China, your business school in Shanghai. So what courses do you currently teach?
Yeah, I'm doing digital strategy in Shanghai, and then digital transformation in Sasin, Chulalongkorn. I base myself in Thailand, but my stomping ground is, it traditionally has been China and Southeast Asia. I go where the companies are. So a lot of time in Beijing, a lot of time in Hangzhou, a lot of time in Shenzhen, Singapore, Jakarta. The tech companies are all in certain places. And that's been, COVID changed that, so I've been on the ground more. But and now I spend a lot more time in Europe and Latin America, because there's just a lot going on.
So Jeff, I know you travel to a lot of places around the world, especially where newer technology is happening, and you're also a consultant. Could you tell us a little bit about what sort of clients you serve?
Yeah, we work with management teams, everything from Fortune 100 companies to, local retailers, supermarkets, banks, in various countries around the world. It's pretty much everywhere. It's Asia, it's Europe, it's Brazil. I'm on the road all the time. And yeah, we help them sort of think about digital transformation and where they need to be and how they rank and what the risks are. And that can be everything from, 2-week quick engagements just to give them an assessment and a quick plan, or, full engagements with teams on the ground and, doing their digital strategy, digital transformation. Usually it's a combination of two things. Usually it's like, what should we do this year? What matters most? How can we do what we're doing better? Because usually they often have a plan for what they're already working on. That's pretty good work. That tends to work out quite well. And then it's also like, where do we need to be in 1 to 2 years so that we're in good shape? You kind of want a longer term view and hey, let's get this done in the next couple months. Usually that's ends up being the plan that we work on them with. So yeah, it's great, but it's retail, it's automotive, it's banks, it's, digital's everywhere now. So
Yeah. And I know you have published a new book series, Moats and Marathons, How to Build and Measure Competitive Advantage in Digital Businesses. Could you maybe share with us a little bit what the series is about?
yeah, this is sort of, there's a lot of talk about digital transformation. Okay, there's a lot of stuff you have to do every day. I focus on how do you win? Like, what activities do you need to do such that, you're dominant and you're on the top, you're protected as a business. That's sort of the moats. Warren Buffett, competitive advantage. You got to build a moat or a marathon. Those are the two activities I think you need to do to really become a dominant, protected business. And that's what I focus on. So those books are about how do you build a competitive advantage in a digital business? And it could be a digital native or a more traditional business that's going software. And I've written, it's a 5-part series, that sounds like a lot, but they're actually pretty short books. So the first 3 have been published. They're like $4 or something. It's not a big deal. You can read it in about an hour. And but yeah, when I'm laying out basically a framework for this is how you win in a world of constant change, which is what we're basically living in.
Interesting. And maybe could you offer some tips for example, a small or medium-sized tech company, how to be more competitive in the current age?
Yeah, generally when people start talking about digital, you hear something to the effect of you got to be agile, you got to be quick,
Right.
You got to be fast. It's like, well, yeah, okay. What are we just gonna speed walk around the office? That doesn't help me. I generally tell them the number one thing there's a lot that's out of your control as a business, especially as a small business. Most smaller businesses, they're not Amazon. They're not changing the world. The most important thing they can do is build up defenses so that they are as resistant as possible to digital disruption. Because when you're protected, that buys you time. And you get more warning for when things are coming. It's like you want to build a moat around the castle as much as you can because that's going to give you time to assess. And then second to that, okay, now let's go for growth. Now let's go for improvement. Now let's go for profits. But generally, building a barrier, a moat, is your best first move against constant change. And then from there, usually you go for growth.
Right. Something that's original or that's only you can do, a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for all your insights on platform economy to, the differences between East and West in terms of their digital strategy and going into the payments, even comparing Latin America to Asia and China. I really learned a lot, and it was a great pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
That was digital strategy expert Jeffrey Towson. That's it for this episode of AntKast. To make sure you don't miss a single episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Eric Hong, coming to you from Shanghai. Goodbye for now.